The night Jed Coloulton walked into his cabin, he didn't know his life was already over. Some silences don't wait for permission. They step inside with you. And when the truth finally breathes, it shatters everything a man thought he was. The cabin smelled of pinewood smoke and slow-simmered stew, a familiar scent that should have meant home, rest, safety. But the air felt wrong, thick and unmoving, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. It was the kind of stillness that comes before a rifle shot, the kind that warns a man before his world splits clean in two. Jed Coloulton pushed the door open and stepped inside, boots heavy on the worn planks. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. The table sat where it always had. His father's old rifle rack still leaned against the wall. Then his eyes dropped to the floor beside the rug, and his chest tightened. A pair of boots lay there, toes pointed toward the hallway. Not his boots, not anyone who belonged in this house. Jed stood very still. The fire crackled softly. Then he heard it, a sound so quiet it almost slipped past him. A woman's voice, breathless, familiar, whispering a name that was not his. Something cold slid down his spine. Jed moved toward the hallway like a man already dead, drifting toward his own grave. The floorboards groaned beneath him in the same old rhythm he had known since boyhood, but tonight every creak landed different, each one a hammer striking his ribs. He reached the bedroom door and paused, his hand hovering on the latch. Then he opened it. Lena lay tangled in the bed, hair spread across the pillow, her bare shoulder pressed against Cal Dawn's chest. Cal, his friend, his brother in everything but blood, the man who had ridden beside him through cattle drives, stood with him in Gunsmoke, shared food and silence through winters that nearly killed them. The same man who once helped him bury a wedding dress after his second wife walked away, leaving nothing behind but dust and shame. They froze. Cal's face drained to ash. Lena yanked the quilt to her chin, but her wide green eyes held more defiance than fear. Jed didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He didn't move at all, because sometimes silence cuts deeper than bullets ever could. "Get out," he said quietly. "Both of you. Get out!" Cal scrambled from the bed, hands shaking as he fumbled into his clothes, not daring to meet Jed's eyes. Lena stayed seated, spine straight, as if daring him to break her. "Jed, let me explain." The word cracked something inside him. "Explain," he said, his voice splintering like dry timber. "Explain how my best friend is in my bed with my pregnant wife. Explain how the child I've thanked God for every night isn't even mine." Outside, the Montana wind howled through the pines, raw and grieving, like the land itself was mourning with him. Jed had spent his adult life running from a single truth, one whispered behind hands in town, one he never said aloud he could not: father a child. His first wife, Sarah May, prayed until hope hollowed her out, then ran off with a traveling salesman. His second wife, Rebecca, stayed longer, tried harder, then left him for a railroad engineer when years passed with nothing to show. And now Lena, his third wife, married more from hope than love, sat before him carrying another man's baby. Lena lifted her chin. "This child needs a real father," she said flatly. "Someone who can give him life. You can't. Everyone knows it, Jed. They whisper about you in town. You're strong enough to break horses, but weak where it matters most. I did what I had to do." Her words carved him open. "So you chose to shame me in my own home," he said. "I saved you," she replied coldly. "The town will believe the baby is yours. Your name will live on. Isn't that what you wanted?" Something collapsed inside him. A truth he hadn't wanted to face. He had married Lena for a legacy, for a child to carry the Coloulton name. But a legacy built on lies tasted like ash. "Be gone by morning," he said. "Take what you need. Take the child, too. He was never mine." Jed walked through Copper Ridge like a man between worlds. People stared with the kind of pity that burns worse than cruelty. He didn't know how he ended up at the train station. The 4:30 from Denver hissed against the platform, steam curling like ghosts around the planks. That's when he heard it, a woman crying, not softly but breaking apart. She sat alone on a bench, clutching a telegram like it was the last piece of her life. Dark hair spilled loose around a grief-stricken face. When he approached, she looked up, storm-gray eyes swollen and red. "Ma'am," he said gently. "Do you need help?" "My husband," she whispered. He's dead, the paper trembled. Silver mine accident. Deepest regrets. Jed lowered his hat. I'm sorry. Do you have family here? She shook her head. No, I came for a teaching job. He was supposed to follow next month. Her voice cracked. He didn't know. He didn't know he was going to be a father. Her hand drifted to her stomach. Jed felt the world tilt. He had lost a child that wasn't his. She had lost a husband who would never know his own son. I'm Jed Coloulton, he said quietly. If you need a place to rest tonight. My cabin isn't far. She studied his face, reading the exhaustion and truth there, then nodded. Back at the cabin, Grace Mitchell sat at his table, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. She noticed the rumpled bed, the empty spaces where another woman's life had been removed in haste. Your wife? She asked softly. Gone, he said. Left today. Grace bowed her head, sharing a silence shaped by loss. When he asked how far along she was, she whispered, 4 months. Thomas would have been so happy. The pain in her voice tightened his chest. What about you? She asked. Children? Jed looked away. 3 wives. None stayed. No children. Understanding filled her eyes, and for the first time that day he didn't feel small. He felt seen. What will you do now? She asked. I don't know. Grace hesitated, then breathed in. What if we help each other? His heart thudded. How? What if we married? The room stilled. Jed stared at her, the idea unreal. You'd marry a stranger? You're not a stranger, she said. You're the man who helped me when you... Didn't have to. He warned. Her of the truth, of Lena, of the lie that broke him. Grace listened, eyes gentle. And here you are, he finished. Carrying a child whose father will never know him? We're both alone, she said, and both judged if we stay that way. The town would tear them apart separately. Together, maybe they could stand. If we do this, Jed said, the child will be mine in every way. She nodded. Yes, completely. 3 days later, outside the Copper Ridge courthouse, Jed stood beside Grace, wildflowers in her hands, uncertainty and hope sharing the same breath. You sure? He asked. Are you? She returned. Inside, the ceremony took 10 minutes. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Jed kissed her, soft, careful. It wasn't fire. It was something steadier. When they returned to the cabin, she whispered, It's home. That night, lying awake, Jed felt something new settle over him. Not certainty, but possibility. From the next room came Grace's voice. Good night, Jed. Good night, Grace. And for the first time in years, he slept without regret, pressing down on his chest. The weeks that followed their quiet courthouse wedding passed with an unfamiliar calm, the kind that feels fragile at first, as if one loud sound might shatter it. Jed moved through each day carefully, like a man learning to walk on a leg that had once been broken. Grace settled into the cabin without trying to change it, which somehow mattered more to him than if she had tried to make it beautiful. She cooked simply, cleaned without comment, and spoke only when there was something worth saying. At night, they stayed to their separate rooms. The thin walls holding a respectful distance, neither of them was ready to cross. Yet the cabin no longer felt hollow. It breathed again. Mornings came with the sound of Grace humming softly while she brewed coffee, her voice low and steady, carrying a tune her late husband once loved. Jed found himself lingering near the doorway, listening, feeling something unknot in his chest. He returned to work with a focus he hadn't felt in years, chopping wood until his arms burned, mending fences, breaking ice from the water troughs. Grace watched him sometimes from the window, hands folded over her growing belly, eyes thoughtful. They talked in the evenings not about the past at first, but about small things, weather, horses, the schoolhouse she'd hoped to teach in, the way the mountains changed color just before sunset. Slowly, carefully, their conversations deepened. Grace told him about Thomas, about how gentle he was, how he used to leave notes in her books when she wasn't looking. Jed spoke of his father, a hard man softened only by land and labor, and a mother who died too young. They never spoke of Lena, not yet. As Grace's belly rounded, Jed grew more protective without realizing it. Walking on the outside edge of the road in town, lifting heavy things from her hands before she asked. When townsfolk congratulated them, Grace smiled politely and Jed nodded, keeping his voice low. He felt the weight of every look, every calculation behind polite eyes, but he said nothing. One evening, as snow fell thick and silent, Grace surprised him by asking, "Do you regret it?" He knew what she meant. "No," he said after a moment. "Do you?" She shook her head. "I don't think God brings people together by accident," she said quietly. The words stayed with him long after she'd gone to bed. Months passed. Winter tightened its grip, then slowly loosened. Grace's steps grew slower. Her breathing changed. Jed found himself waking at night listening for movement, afraid she might need him and he wouldn't hear. He kept the wagon ready, Doc Harrison's number committed to memory. When the morning finally came, it arrived sudden and sharp. Grace's cry cut through the gray dawn like a blade. "Jed!" she gasped. Pain and fear tangled together. He was on his feet instantly, boots half-laced as he ran for the horse. The ride to fetch the doctor felt endless, every second pounding in his skull. By the time they returned, Grace was pale, teeth clenched, sweat soaking her hair. Jed stayed near the door at first, hands useless, heart hammering. He had faced men with guns without flinching, but this terrified him. Hours crawled past, marked by Grace's cries and Doc Harrison's calm instructions. Jed prayed without words, his hat crushed between his hands. Then, finally, a sound broke through the pain, a thin, furious cry. Doc Harrison emerged smiling. "You've got yourself a son." Jed's knees nearly gave out. Grace lay exhausted but glowing, cradling a small bundle. "Meet your son," she whispered. Jed stepped forward, hands trembling as he looked down at the tiny face, dark eyes blinking up at him like they already knew him. "He's perfect," he breathed. "He's ours," Grace said, and the words settled deep inside him. They named him Thomas, and as sunlight spilled through the cabin windows, warming the walls, Jed felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Not hope, belonging, the days that followed blurred together in sleepless nights and quiet miracles. Thomas slept curled against Grace, or against Jed's arm when she needed rest. Jed learned the weight of the boy, the sound of his breathing, the way his small fingers wrapped instinctively around his own. He rocked him by the fire, whispering promises no one had ever made to him. Outside, Copper Ridge buzzed with news. Most folks were kind. Some were not. Whispers crept through the town like smoke. Too quick, they said, too big. Jed heard it all and said nothing. He had promised Grace protection, and silence was part of that shield. Trouble came anyway. One cold afternoon at Murphy's Mercantile, Jed felt it before he saw it. Cal Dawn's voice behind him, thinner than memory, rough with regret. "Jed." Jed didn't turn. "We don't need to talk. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." The word hit hard, but it wasn't enough. Jed faced him then, seeing not the betrayer but a man already punished by his own choices. "Go home, Cal," he said, "and don't come near my family." Cal nodded and walked away, leaving Jed lighter than he'd been in years. That night, as Grace rocked Thomas by the fire, Jed watched her, the warmth of the hearth painting her face soft and strong. Love settled over him then, slow and undeniable. "Grace," he said. She looked up. "Our marriage didn't start as love," he said. "But it's become something real." She stood, stepping close. "I've fallen in love with the life we're building," she whispered. "And I've fallen in love with you." The words anchored him. "I love you," he said back, sure and steady. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the Coloulton family stood whole, no longer defined by blood or loss, but by choice, loyalty, and a love forged in the hardest season of their lives. Time moved differently after that. No longer measured in seasons of loss, but in small living moments. Thomas's cries at dawn. Grace's soft laughter when the baby curled his fingers around Jed's beard. The steady rhythm of work that no longer felt like punishment but purpose. Jed rose each morning before the sun, splitting wood, tending horses, repairing what winters had tried to destroy. Every nail he drove, every fence post he set, felt like a promise hammered into the earth. Grace took to motherhood with a quiet strength that humbled him. She learned Thomas's needs by instinct, yet never pushed Jed aside. Instead, she made room for him, guiding his hands when he was unsure, smiling when he fumbled. At night, when the baby finally slept, they sat together near the hearth, close enough that their shoulders touched, far enough to respect the slow pace they'd chosen. They spoke of the future now. A garden in spring, a larger table when Thomas grew, maybe another room added to the cabin. Jed listened, imagining a life that stretched forward instead of ending abruptly at disappointment. In town, the whispers hadn't stopped, but they softened. People grew tired of suspicion when faced with consistency. Grace held her head high, and Jed stood firm beside her. The child grew strong. Doc Harrison said as much, nodding approvingly during visits. Healthy boy, he'd say. Lucky parents. Jed carried those words like medals. Still, not all wounds healed clean. Some nights, Jed woke from dreams of Lena's voice, of Cal's face in the doorway, of empty cradles and laughing townsfolk. Grace never asked why he stiffened in the dark. She simply reached for his hand, grounding him. One evening, as snow began to fall again, Grace spoke the words he'd feared and needed all at once. Jed, she said softly, do you ever think about her? He knew who she meant. Sometimes, he admitted. Not because I miss her, because I don't want that bitterness following me into this life. Grace nodded. Then let it end here, she said. We don't owe our pain a future. He looked at her then, truly looked and knew the past no longer owned him. Spring came slow and bright. Thomas learned to laugh, a sound so pure it startled Jed every time. He carried the boy on his shoulders across open fields, letting him grip his hair and squeal at the world below. Grace watched them from the porch, eyes shining. That was the moment Jed understood the truth he'd been circling all his life. He hadn't been denied fatherhood. He'd been prepared for it. The right child, the right woman, the right moment. One afternoon, as Jed repaired a fence near the ridge, he saw a familiar figure approaching along the dirt path. Lena. She looked thinner, older, her pride dulled by hardship. Jed's chest tightened, but he didn't retreat. She stopped a few feet away, eyes flicking toward the cabin in the distance. I heard, she said. You have a son. I do, Jed replied calmly. He's well. Silence stretched between them. I was wrong, she said at last, the words brittle. About you. Jed studied her, feeling no anger, no triumph. Only distance. That's something you'll have to live with, he said. I already have. She nodded once, turned, and walked away. Jed watched her go, then turned back toward home, lighter than he'd ever been. That night, he told Grace everything. She listened without interruption, then leaned her head against his shoulder. You chose us, she said simply. That's what matters. Summer settled over Copper Ridge, warm and forgiving. Thomas took his first steps on unsteady legs, laughing when he fell. Jed caught him every time. Grace watched, heart full, knowing the truth that had reshaped all their lives. This family wasn't born of blood alone, but of courage, forgiveness, and the choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. And Jed Coloulton, once a man hollowed by shame, stood taller than ever, grounded in a love that no rumor, no betrayal, no past mistake could ever undo. The years that followed did not arrive gently, but they arrived honestly, and that was enough. Thomas grew sturdy and curious, a child shaped by open land and patient hands. He followed Jed everywhere, dragging sticks twice his size, asking endless questions about horses, fences, clouds, and why the mountains changed colors when the sun dipped low. Jed answered everyone, even when he didn't know the truth, because answering meant staying present, and presence had become the promise he refused to break. Grace watched them together with a quiet, settled joy, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. She returned to teaching at the small schoolhouse outside town once. Thomas was old enough to follow along and sit quietly, with a slate and chalk. The townsfolk noticed the difference. They always did. Rumors withered when faced with years of consistency. Jed paid his debts, helped neighbors without being asked, and raised his son with a firmness tempered by kindness. Grace earned respect the same way, through patience, intelligence, and an unshakable calm. Slowly, Copper Ridge stopped watching them and started accepting them. Even so, the past had a way of circling back when least expected. One autumn evening, as wind rattled the windows and smoke curled from the chimney, Jed sat by the fire cleaning his rifle. Thomas asleep on a blanket nearby. Grace folded laundry at the table, the soft domestic sounds filling the room. "Jed," she said suddenly, her voice careful. "If Thomas ever asks." He looked up. "About his father?" She nodded. Jed thought for a long moment, watching the fire breathe. "I'll tell him the truth," he said. "That he had two fathers, one who gave him life, and one who chose him every single day." Grace's eyes filled, but she smiled. "That's all he'll ever need." Winter came hard that year. Snow buried fences, froze trails, and trapped the cabin in silence broken only by wind and flame. It was during one of those long nights that Jed finally understood the full weight of what he had been given. He woke to Thomas crying. Not from hunger, but from fear. A child's dream turned dark. Jed lifted him gently, rocking him until the sobs faded. "I've got you," he whispered, the words meant for both of them. Thomas's small hand clutched his shirt, trusting without question. Jed felt it then, clear and undeniable. He had never been incomplete. He had simply been waiting. Spring thawed the land and something else besides. Grace and Jed grew closer in ways neither rushed nor resisted. Love between them deepened, no longer careful, no longer tentative. It was built from shared mornings, shared worries, shared pride. On a quiet afternoon, while Thomas played in the grass, Grace took Jed's hand. "I don't feel like we're pretending anymore," she said. Jed smiled. "Neither do I." They kissed then, not out of obligation or hope, but certainty. Years later, when Thomas stood tall enough to look his father in the eye, Jed took him to the ridge overlooking Copper Valley. The wind moved through the pines, steady and familiar. "You know," Jed said, resting a hand on his son's shoulder, "being a father isn't about blood." Thomas nodded, already knowing. "It's about staying," Jed finished. Thomas leaned into him, solid and sure. Back at the cabin, Grace watched them from the doorway, the life they built stretching behind her like a long, hard road finally leading somewhere good. Jed Coloulton had once believed he was broken beyond repair. Standing there now, surrounded by love chosen and earned, he knew better. A man is not made whole by what he can give in body, but by what he gives in heart. And his heart, once empty and ashamed, now beats strong within a family forged. Not by fate alone, but by courage, loyalty, and love that refused to leave. Blood didn't make him a father. Love did, and it always would.